What if the country's most powerful politician is hiding a secret that could not only ruin his career, but undermine the foundations of American democracy? The black armored Cadillac one, known as the Beast, slowed to a stop outside the nondescript service entrance of NBC's television studio. The digital clock on the dashboard read 17:43. There was just over an hour left until the live broadcast. Vice President James Vance looked out through tinted glass at the Washington sky, where the sunset was still fading to the west, painting the clouds blood red, and darkness was closing in from the east. The visual metaphor seemed too obvious even for Hollywood, but reality rarely bothers with subtleties. The phone in Vance's hand vibrated like a trapped insect. 23 notifications in the last 40 minutes. Everyone in the White House needed to know how they were going to respond to the bombshell that had been dropped in this morning's paper. Vance swiped his finger across the screen and opened the latest message from the president. Laconic as always. I believe in you. Do what you think is right. We have arrived, Mr. Vice President, said Harry Johnson, his Secret Service Chief of Security. Security perimeter confirmed. Vance put the phone in the inside pocket of his jacket and nodded. Thanks, Harry. I bet you'd rather I was testifying before Congress on national security issues today than going on this show. A ghost of a smile flickered across Johnson's face, a rare occurrence for a man whose job involved being prepared to take a bullet every day. It's my job to protect you, Mr. Vice President, no matter how creative your decisions are, Vance chuckled. His decision to appear on Marcus Bennett's program was called political suicide by 3 senior White House advisors, an unforgivable mistake by his chief of staff, and a disastrously courageous move by the president. Sometimes the best defense is a straight talk, Harry. You remember our first patrol in Fallujah? Johnson, who had served in the same Marine unit as Vance years ago, nodded briefly. Of course, sir, but at least we had weapons then. I have a gun today, too. Vance patted his inside pocket, where a small battered Bible lay. Really? The doors of the Beast opened and 6 Secret Service agents instantly created a human corridor to the service entrance. Vance got out of the car, straightened his tie, and walked inside the building, where a nervous production assistant was waiting for him. Mr. Vice President, it's a great honor. She trailed off as Vance removed his sunglasses and looked at her with piercing gray-blue eyes. I'm Amanda, and I'll be accompanying you to the broadcast. Thank you, Amanda, Vance smiled, softening the severity of his appearance. And please, just call me J.D. Formalities only complicate communication. Amanda blushed but pulled herself together professionally, checking her tablet. Okay, J.D., we've got your dressing room ready. We have about 40 minutes before we go live. Mr. Bennett asked me to tell you he'd like to meet with you before the interview, but your press secretary has already declined that request, citing protocol. I'll meet him, Vance interrupted, shocking not only Amanda but his own team, who were following him. Sir, said Sarah Coleman, his press secretary, immediately, I would strongly recommend that you follow standard procedure. Bennett is known for his... I know what Marcus Bennett is known for, Sarah. Vance's voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it that was familiar to anyone who had worked with him in crisis situations. That's why I want to look him in the eye before the cameras roll. Tell him he can be there in 20 minutes. As they walked through the studio corridors, Vance felt the eyes of his staff on him. Curious, assessing, sometimes downright hostile. The morning's Washington Post article had done its job. A two-faced Janus in the White House. The Secret History of James David Vance. The article was a masterpiece of political journalism in the worst sense of the word. It contained no outright lies, only half-truths, out-of-context quotes, and anonymous sources that implied that Vance's entire political evolution, from liberal to conservative, from critic of the president to his closest ally, was not the result of genuine self-reflection, but cynical political calculation. Particularly poignant was the paragraph devoted to his faith. Vance's journey to God appears to be remarkably in tune with his political ambitions. Sources close to the vice president say his religiosity has grown noticeably at a time when polls have shown that conservative voters are looking for a candidate who can speak their language. The dressing room was a small but comfortable room with a huge mirror surrounded by bright lamps, a leather chair, and a small sofa against the far wall. On the table in front of the mirror was laid out a professional makeup kit, bottles of water, and a tablet with the text of the article that was the reason for his presence here today. We've prepared a set of possible questions and answers. Sarah handed him a black folder when they were alone. The team analyzed all of Bennett's interviews over the past 2 years and identified his favorite tactics. He likes to ask questions straightforwardly to catch his interviewer off guard, then switch to a friendly tone to lull them into a false sense of security, and then Vance raised his hand, stopping the flow of information. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the team's work, but today we will go a different way. He put the folder on the table without opening it. What other way, sir? Sarah's voice was alarmed. We spent the whole night making up these. I'm going to tell the truth, Sarah. No preambles, no strategies, no political evasions. Just the truth. The press secretary looked at him as if he had just suggested skydiving without a parachute. Sir, with all due respect, this is national television. Marcus Bennett is a predator who seeks out weak spots and strikes at them without mercy. If you go in unprepared— I didn't say without preparation, Vance corrected gently. I've been preparing for this conversation my entire life. Every day in my grandmother's trailer in Middletown, every patrol in Iraq, every time I was made fun of at Yale for my accent, that was preparation. My life is preparation, Sarah. There was a knock at the door. Sarah cast one last pleading glance at Vance, but seeing his determined expression, she gave in. Okay, sir, but I'll be backstage. If anything goes wrong— Everything will be fine, Vance said confidently. Let him in and leave us alone. When the door opened, Vance found Marcus Bennett, the host of the country's highest-rated political show, known for his ruthless interviewing style. Bennett was the epitome of a successful TV presenter. Impeccably dressed in Tom Ford, perfectly coiffed, with a smile that would have lit up the room if not for the cold, calculating gaze that betrayed his true predatory nature. Mr. Vice President, Bennett extended his hand to shake. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Most politicians prefer to see me only when the cameras are already on. Vance shook the outstretched hand, noting the firm but overly precise grip, another element of the carefully constructed image. Most politicians are afraid to face the truth, Marcus, and I've spent too much time under fire to be afraid of a journalist, no matter how talented. Bennett smiled, not a professional smile for the cameras, but the real, fleeting smile of a man who appreciates candor. Frankly, I like it. But let's be honest, Mr. Vice President. My show is not a place for comfortable conversation. Many of your colleagues have left this studio as political corpses. You can call me J.D., Vance replied, motioning Bennett to the couch and taking a seat in the chair opposite him. And yes, I know about your reputation. That's why I'm here, so we both know what we're getting into. Bennett sat up, placing the thin folder he had brought with him on his lap. Normally, I'd say I appreciate your openness, but we both know it's part of your image, right? The kid from the poor, the Marine who went through Iraq, the Yale grad who never forgot his roots. The story is too good to be true. Vance didn't flinch, meeting the journalist's piercing gaze. And that's why you're here, Marcus? To prove that this is all a facade? I'm here to ask the questions that matter to the American people, Bennett replied with professional smoothness. For example, how did a man who wrote that the president is a threat to democratic institutions suddenly become their closest ally? How did a former liberal become a model conservative? And my favorite question, when exactly did you discover that faith in God was compatible with political ambition? The last question was spoken with barely concealed mockery, and Vance felt anger rising in him, not for himself, but for the millions of religious Americans who were regularly portrayed by the elite media as either backward, fanatics, or hypocrites. Do you have children, Marcus? Vance asked unexpectedly. Bennett blinked, confused by the change in topic. 2. But I don't understand what this has to do. Do you love them? Of course, the journalist's voice sounded irritated. But we're not here to discuss my family. When exactly did you realize you loved them? Vance continued, not backing down. Was there a specific moment, or did it grow gradually, day by day, year by year? Bennett paused, clearly trying to figure out what the vice president was getting at. I don't remember the exact moment, he finally answered. It just happened. Exactly. Vance leaned forward, his gaze locked on Bennett's. Profound change rarely happens in a single moment, Marcus. My political evolution, my path to faith, it was all a gradual process, just like your love for your children. The only difference is that my transformation took place before the eyes of the entire country. Bennett opened the folder and pulled out a printout. Let me quote your own words from an interview with The Atlantic 6 years ago. Identity politics and traditionalism are a dead end for America. We need progressive solutions based on data, not dogma. And now, just 3 years later, you're writing in your column, traditional values are the foundation on which American exceptionalism rests. He looked up from the paper. This is not a gradual evolution, Mr. Vice President. This is a political somersault, calculated for a certain electorate. Vance took a deep breath. He knew that quote would come up. It came up in every critical article about him. Do you know what happened between these two statements, Marcus? Enlighten me. The journalist's voice was skeptical. I spent 6 months traveling through small towns in the Midwest and Appalachia, researching what would become my book. I talked to people the Washington political elite chooses to ignore. Workers whose factories have closed, families devastated by the opioid crisis, veterans who feel forgotten by the country they fought for. Vance paused, remembering the faces of these people. And you know what I discovered? That for these people, traditional values, faith, family, patriotism, are not empty words for Sunday sermons or political speeches. They are literally what helps them survive in the darkest times. I saw how faith sustains communities where the state has long retreated. Bennett snorted skeptically. And that changed your views on the economy, immigration, tax policy, health care, and a dozen other issues? Sounds like a convenient explanation for political opportunism. It changed my understanding of American reality, Vance said firmly. When you see policies you supported in theory ruining real people's lives, you start asking yourself questions. And yes, that can lead to a reevaluation of many positions. Bennett shook his head. What about your sudden religiosity? My sources say that before your political career, you rarely attended church, and now you quote the Bible in every speech. For the first time in the entire conversation, Vance felt his mask of calm begin to crack. This question touched on something deeply personal. Your sources? He said the word with undisguised contempt. Allow me to call you a bad man? Anonymous, people familiar with my thoughts? Is this modern journalism, Marcus? Inventing sources to support a preconceived notion? He took a small, battered Bible from his inside pocket. My grandmother gave me this Bible when I was 9 years old. There's an inscription on the flyleaf dated 1993. Would you like to see it? Or does that not fit into your theory about my sudden religiosity? Bennett looked slightly embarrassed, but quickly regained his composure. Having a Bible does not mean deep faith. Of course not, Vance agreed. Just as having a marriage license doesn't guarantee a happy family life. Faith is a journey, Marcus. Sometimes you're closer to God, sometimes you're further. But to suggest that my faith is a political tool is an insult not only to me, but to the millions of Americans whose faith is the center of their lives. Bennett stared at the vice president in silence, as if seeing him in a new light. Then he glanced at his watch. We have 10 minutes left before the broadcast. I must warn you that the conversation in the studio will be tougher. I will ask all these questions again, and many more, if you are hoping for indulgences because of your status. Vance smiled, but there was no warmth in the smile. You don't understand why I'm here, do you? I didn't come to defend myself, Marcus. I came to show America that politics can be honest, that it's okay to tell the truth even when it's inconvenient, that it's okay to change your mind based on new facts and experience, without fear of being labeled a traitor or an opportunist. He stood up, signaling that the preliminary meeting was over. And one more thing, Marcus. Today you think you're interviewing me, but I guarantee that by the end of our conversation, the American people will be evaluating not just me, but you, and all the cynicism that you and your colleagues have brought to our public discourse. Bennett rose too, his face impassive, but with something like respect mingled with challenge in his eyes. Bold words, Mr. Vice President. We'll see how sincere they are when the cameras roll. When the reporter left, Vance was alone in the dressing room. He walked to the mirror and looked at his reflection, the face of a man who had risen from the poverty of Appalachia to the second highest office in the land. A face on which life had left its marks, the wrinkles around his eyes from squinting in the Iraqi sun, the crease between his brows from sleepless nights poring over law books at Yale, the gray at his temples from the stress of political life. He remembered all the critical articles, all the ridicule, all the accusations of betraying his true convictions. As if a person had no right to grow, to change, to reevaluate his views based on new experiences. There was another knock on the door. This time it was the makeup artist who had come to prepare him for the bright light of the studio spotlights. Come in, Vance said, straightening up and squaring his shoulders. No matter how the upcoming interview turned out, he was ready to meet it with the same dignity with which he had met all the challenges in his life, from poverty and war to the highest corridors of power. Outside the studio windows, the last rays of sunset gave way to the darkness of night. But inside Vance, a fire of determination was burning. Today, he was not just defending his reputation, he was defending the right of every person to seek truth honestly, to change and grow, to be authentic in a world that demands conformity to fixed labels. 5 minutes until the exit, Mr. Vice President, said the assistant director, looking into the dressing room. Vance nodded. The hour of truth was approaching. The NBC studio was aglow with dozens of spotlights, creating the illusion of daylight in the middle of the night. Cameras like birds of prey were trained on two leather chairs at center stage. The 150 people in the audience chatted quietly, anticipating the spectacle. Backstage, assistants with headphones scurried like ants, checking the last details before the live broadcast. Marcus Bennett stood in the shadows behind the set, mechanically adjusting his perfectly fitting tie. 20 years in the business hadn't cured him of the jitters before every broadcast, especially one like tonight. His producer, Diana Hendricks, approached with a clipboard. "It's all set, Marcus. The preview ratings are off the charts. It seems like all of America is tuned in to watch you trash the vice president." Bennett winced. "I'm not going to trash him, Diana. I'm going to ask questions that Americans deserve answers to." Of course. Diana didn't hide her sarcasm. "That's why you prepared 20 minutes of archival footage of his contradictory statements, to ask questions. You yourself said that it would be a ratings bomb. And it's true." Diana checked the data on her tablet. The hashtag #Vance against Bennett is already trending on Twitter. Place your bets. Conservatives think you're too liberal, liberals think you're not tough enough, and radicals on both sides just want blood. Typical America. Bennett took a deep breath. "Give me a minute, okay? I want to concentrate." "Sure." Diana patted him on the shoulder. "Just remember, no breaks. This guy represents everything we stand against." When she left, Bennett closed his eyes for a moment. Everything we stand against. The phrase rang in his ears. When had journalism gone from a search for truth to an ideological war? And when had he become a soldier in that war? Across the studio, in a small guest room, James David Vance sat alone. He had asked his crew to leave him alone for these last minutes before going on air. The strange calm he had known from days in Iraq before dangerous missions had descended on him. Selena Ramirez, the young assistant director, knocked quietly and peered inside. "Mr. Vice President, we begin in 2 minutes. You will be escorted to the stage after Mr. Bennett's opening monologue." "Thank you, Selena." Vance smiled at her. "You look tense. Is everything okay?" The girl shifted from foot to foot uncertainly. "It's just, everyone's saying this is going to be the toughest interview of the year. And my father's a big fan of yours. He's an immigrant from Mexico, became a citizen 5 years ago. He said you're the only politician who talks like a real person, not a robot." Vance nodded. "Thank your father for his support, and don't worry about the harshness of the interview. The truth can withstand any fire." When the assistant left, Vance checked his inside jacket pocket again. The Bible was there, as was the small photograph of his grandmother that he always carried with him. He was not superstitious, but these two objects served as an anchor in the stormy waters of politics. The famous theme song of Straight Talk with Marcus Bennett came from the speakers, and the show began. "Good evening, America." Bennett's voice had been honed by years of practice to the perfect balance between authority and accessibility. Today is a special edition. Our guest is a man whose name has been on the front pages for the last 24 hours. A man who has risen from an administration critic to the country's second in command. A man who many say embodies a profound political transformation, or, as others say, the unprincipled opportunism of modern politics. The camera pulled back smoothly to reveal an empty chair next to Bennett. Vice President James David Vance agreed to answer all questions, with no pre-agreed list, no off-limits topics. In a world where politicians surround themselves with a wall of press secretaries and prepared phrases, that's unusual. Bennett paused, looking directly into the camera. 20. But before we invite the vice president, let's remember how this story began. This morning, the Washington Post published a resonant investigation into the political evolution of James David Vance. From liberal views to conservatism, from criticism of the president to unconditional support, from skepticism to public religiosity. The article's headlines and key quotes appeared on a large screen behind Bennett. Many people asked themselves, what is this? A sincere transformation or a cynical calculation? What is behind this transformation? A spiritual search or a political calculator? Today, we will try to find the answers. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the Vice President of the United States of America, James David Vance. The room erupted in applause as Vance emerged from the wings. His gait was confident but not arrogant, his smile warm but not ingratiating. He shook Bennett's hand and sat in the chair opposite, his shoulders squared and his eyes fixed on the host. "Good evening, Marcus. Thank you for the invitation." "Mr. Vice President," Bennett leaned forward slightly, "let me begin with a direct question. Today's article in the Washington Post essentially accuses you of political hypocrisy. How do you respond to these charges?" Vance thought for a moment, as if he were actually considering the question rather than reciting a prepared answer. "You know, Marcus, there is a fundamental difference between hypocrisy and growth. A hypocrite says one thing and does another. A person who grows changes his views in response to new experiences and information. I do not hide the fact that my political positions have evolved over the past years, but it was an evolution based on real experience and observations, not on political expediency. That sounds convincing, Bennett nodded with a hint of irony, but let me quote your interview with The New Yorker in 2016. I quote, "The administration's policies represent a dangerous combination of populism and authoritarianism. I cannot imagine a scenario in which I could support such an approach to governing the country." End of quote. Bennett looked up from his notes. "And now you don't just support this administration, you're an integral part of it. Doesn't that seem contradictory?" A slight whisper ran through the room. The first shot was fired. Vance didn't show the slightest discomfort. "That's a great question, Marcus, and I won't duck the question. Yes, I have been a critic of many aspects of the current administration. I have voiced my concerns openly and honestly." He paused as if inviting the audience to really think about his words. But here's what happened next. I started seeing real results from the policies I had criticized in theory. I saw new jobs appear in areas that had suffered from deindustrialization for decades. I saw families in my home state of Ohio experience economic stability for the first time in a long time. He leaned forward, his voice becoming quieter, more intimate. "I could have continued to criticize on principle, Marcus. It would have been politically safe in my academic circles, but I chose to admit that my initial assessment was incomplete. I chose sincerity over comfort." Bennett clearly hadn't expected such directness. He looked momentarily taken aback, but quickly regained control. "That's an interesting interpretation, but many observers have noted that your evolution has coincided surprisingly with your political ambitions. Is that just a coincidence?" "No coincidence," Vance replied with a slight smile. "My decision to enter politics was a direct result of this evolution of views, not the other way around. When I realized that my previous beliefs did not correspond to the reality I was observing, I had two options: either ignore the facts and maintain ideological purity, or acknowledge the changes and act accordingly." He straightened his shoulders. "I chose the second path. And yes, it led me to a political career I had not planned. But isn't it better to have a politician who changes his views based on facts than one who stubbornly clings to an ideology, despite the obvious?" There were cheers from the room. Bennett glanced quickly at the producer behind the cameras. Her expression said, "Don't let him take over." "Okay, let's talk facts," Bennett changed tack. "You cited economic improvements as the reason for your evolution. But economists point out that those improvements began under the previous administration. In fact, the data show that income inequality has only worsened under the current administration. Is that consistent with the values you write about in your book?" Vance nodded, acknowledging the seriousness of the question. "You raise an important point, Marcus. Economic statistics are complex, and both sides of the political spectrum can find support for their theses in them. But let me tell you not about macroeconomic indicators, but about what I have seen with my own eyes." He turned to the audience. "When I returned to Middletown, Ohio in 2018, I met John Clarkson, a man who had worked in a steel mill for 20 years, lost his job in a massive layoff, and had been doing temporary work for more than a decade. His situation had not improved under the previous administration, despite all the macroeconomic indicators. Today, John is back at work full-time, with health insurance and with retirement prospects." Vance turned back to Bennett. "You may say this is an isolated incident, but I have seen hundreds of such stories. And yes, income inequality remains a problem. That is why I regularly advocate at cabinet meetings for policies that support the working class, not just corporate America." Bennett looked slightly irritated. "Mr. Vice President, with due respect, anecdotes are no substitute for data. Most economists agree that—" "Most economists," Vance interrupted gently, "have never lived in Appalachia, never seen how the closing of a single factory in a town devastates entire communities, never sat at the kitchen table with a family that must choose between paying the electric bill and buying medicine." He leaned forward. "You see, Marcus, that's the problem with modern political discourse. We've replaced real human experience with abstract data and ideological constructs. We talk about the working class and middle America as if they were statistics, forgetting that we're talking about real people with real problems." A tense silence settled over the studio. Even the most skeptical viewers couldn't help but sense the sincerity in the vice president's words. Bennett realized he was losing control of the conversation and decided to change tactics to a more aggressive one. "Let's go back to your relationship with the president. In a PBS interview in 2016, you said, and I quote, He promises simple solutions to complex problems, which is a sign of either naivety or cynicism. Either way, it disqualifies him as a leader. Those are your words, right? The camera zoomed in on Vance's face, who remained remarkably calm. Yes, these are my words, and I do not renounce them. At that moment, I really thought so. Bennett looked triumphant. Do you think differently now? Have the problems become simpler? Or has the president suddenly become a geopolitical genius? A nervous laugh ran through the room. Bennett felt himself regaining the initiative. Vance paused before answering. You know, Marcus, in the Marine Corps they taught us one important thing. Never judge a man by what other people say about him. Judge him by his actions and how he behaves under fire. He took a deep breath. When I said those words, I knew about the president only what I had read in the press and seen on the news. I had never met him in person, never worked with him, never seen how he made decisions in critical situations. Vance leaned forward, his voice becoming more passionate. And then I got a chance to see him in action. Not on TV debates, not at political rallies, but in the Oval Office, where real problems are being solved for real people. And you know what I found? A man who asks tough questions, demands straight answers, and isn't afraid to make unpopular decisions if he thinks they're the right ones. Bennett shook his head. This sounds like apologetics, Mr. Vice President. We have all seen contradictory statements, questionable decisions, unpredictable policy turns. How can you now defend what you once considered dangerous? Vance looked straight into the camera, as if addressing the audience directly. Because I was wrong, Marcus. That's the simple answer. I judged a man based on incomplete information and biased sources. When I got access to a more complete picture, my opinion changed. He turned back to Bennett. But let's talk about what really matters. Not personalities, but results. During this administration, we've seen record low unemployment among African Americans and Hispanics. We've seen manufacturing return to regions that had been largely written off. We've seen a historic deal in the Middle East that experts thought was impossible. Bennett interrupted him. With all due respect, Mr. Vice President, you are evading the answer. The issue is not about economic indicators, but about your personal 180-degree turn. How can voters trust a person who changes his positions so radically? Vance smiled calmly. Have you ever changed your mind about something important, Marcus? Ever looked at the evidence and realized your original judgment was wrong? Bennett hesitated for a moment. We are discussing your political transformation here, Mr. Vice President, not mine. Exactly, Vance nodded. And it's telling. We live in a strange world where politicians are criticized for the very thing ordinary people are praised for. Their ability to learn, to grow, to change. When a scientist changes his theory in light of new evidence, we call that progress. When a doctor changes his treatment based on new research, we call that a medical breakthrough. But when a politician changes his position based on new experience and information, we call that a reversal and view it as a sign of weakness. A murmur of approval ran through the studio. Many in the audience nodded. Bennett felt he was losing control again and decided to approach it from a different angle. Let's talk specifically about your disagreements with the president. In your famous article in The Atlantic, you wrote about demagogy, populism, and simplistic solutions. Are these accusations no longer relevant? Has the president ceased to be a populist? No, it hasn't, Vance shook his head, and thank God for that. Because, you see, populism is just a dismissive term that the elites use to describe policies that actually speak to the needs of ordinary people. He leaned back in his chair. When a politician promises to protect American jobs, that's populism. When he talks about controlling borders, that's xenophobia. When he talks about reviving industry, that's economic nationalism. Do you see the pattern? Any policy that puts the interests of ordinary Americans above those of global corporations and international organizations is immediately labeled as derogatory. Bennett clearly didn't expect that answer. But isn't the problem that these simple solutions often don't work in a complex world? You wrote about this yourself. I've written about simplistic solutions that ignore the complexity of problems, Vance said, but there's a big difference between simplicity and simplification. Sometimes the most effective solutions are simple, not because they ignore complexity, but because they get to the root of the problem. He looked into the hall. Take trade policy. For decades, so-called experts told us that free trade was good for everyone, that the loss of manufacturing jobs was simply creative destruction, and that workers should simply retrain as programmers or consultants. It sounded very smart, very sophisticated, very elitist. Vance turned back to Bennett. And then came a president who said something simple. We will protect American jobs. We will demand fair trade agreements. We will not allow other countries to exploit our openness. And you know what? It worked. Not because it was a simplistic solution, but because it was principled and right. Bennett looked increasingly irritated. Mr. Vice President, you know very well that the economy is much more complicated. Tariffs have led to retaliatory measures. Farmers have lost markets. Consumers are paying more for imported goods. Of course there are short-term costs, Vance agreed. Any significant change has a cost. But look at the long-term picture. For the first time in decades, we're seeing a resurgence of manufacturing in regions that were effectively consigned to the dustbin of history by the old economic orthodoxy. We're seeing companies bringing their factories back to America. We're seeing communities that are finding hope again. Vance looked straight into the camera. And this is not just an economic issue. This is a question of human dignity. When a person loses his job, not because of his mistakes, but because of abstract market forces and government policy, it destroys not only his financial situation, but also his self-respect, his place in society, his faith in the future. Bennett began to lose patience. Mr. Vice President, with all due respect, you are turning the interview into a political speech. Let's get back to the topic. Your personal political turn. Vance smiled. Not a U-turn, Marcus. An evolution. And it happened precisely because of what I'm talking about now. I saw how the policies I was criticizing theoretically began to help real people, the ones I wrote about in my book. I could either admit I was wrong or cling to my old positions out of pride or political expediency. I chose honesty. Bennett decided to strike hard. Or perhaps, Mr. Vice President, you simply saw a political opportunity, saw the winds changing and decided to go with the flow? Many observers have noted that your evolution has coincided remarkably well with your career ambitions. For a moment, Vance's face tightened, and the camera caught the fleeting emotion. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and firm. You know, Marcus, it's easy to make accusations like that because they're irrefutable. How can I prove my motives are pure? I can't. I can only tell the truth and let people judge for themselves. He leaned forward. Hannah, but let's pretend for a moment that you're right. Suppose I'm a cynical opportunist who saw a political opportunity and seized it. What opportunist in his right mind would choose the path I chose? Bennett raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I was a successful author and commentator, Vance explained. I had a stable career, almost guaranteed appearances on CNN and MSNBC, book deals, speaking fees. I could have continued to criticize the administration, as many of my former colleagues do, and receive plaudits and contracts for it. His voice became quieter, but more intense. Instead, I chose a path that led to former friends turning against me, elite publications calling me a traitor, and my academic colleagues openly expressing contempt. Do you really think that's the choice of an opportunist, Marcus? An opportunist doesn't choose a path that's more thorns than roses. Bennett fell silent, clearly unprepared for such a rebuff. A tense silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of the cameras. We'll be back after a short commercial break, he finally said, looking into the camera with a tight smile. Stay tuned. The most poignant part of our conversation with Vice President James David Vance is coming up. As soon as the off-air sign lit up, Bennett snatched the microphone and quickly walked away to where producer Diana was already waiting. Their conversation was inaudible outside the studio, but their tense body language and facial expressions made it clear that this was not a friendly conversation. Vance remained seated in his chair, refusing his assistant's offer to take him to the break room. He knew that social media was in full swing, that millions of Americans were discussing his every word, every gesture, but he felt strangely calm, the calm of a man who speaks the truth and does not fear the consequences. He knew the hardest part was yet to come. Bennett had only just begun his attack, and the next part of the interview promised to be even tougher. But Vance was ready to defend not only his political decisions, but what was far more important to him, his faith, his values, his authenticity in a world that seemed to have long forgotten the meaning of that word. When the red light of the cell came back on, Marcus Bennett returned to his chair with renewed energy, his eyes gleaming with the adrenaline of a professional hunter who has smelled blood. In his hands, he held a new folder, thinner than the last, but no less menacing. We continue our conversation with Vice President James David Vance, he said with a practiced smile, looking directly into the camera. And now I would like to move on to the topic that probably raises the biggest questions for many observers. He turned to Vance. Mr. Armarito, Vice President, let's talk about your faith. You regularly mention God in your speeches, quote the Bible, and talk about divine guidance in matters of government. Many consider this a violation of the principle of separation of church and state. How do you respond to these accusations? Vance bowed his head slightly, as if acknowledging the seriousness of the question. The Constitution guarantees that the state will not establish an official religion or interfere with the free exercise of religion. It does not require public figures to hide their faith or pretend that it does not influence their worldview. Bennett immediately retorted, "But isn't there a difference between personal faith and the use of religious rhetoric in official speeches? Especially considering that America is a multi-confessional country, where people of all faiths and atheists live." Vance nodded calmly. "Of course there is a difference, and I always respect the right of every American to follow his conscience and his beliefs. But think about this, Marcus. Demanding that a religious politician never mention his faith in public is not neutrality. It is, in fact, discrimination based on religious belief." A murmur ran through the room. Vance had touched on a sensitive topic for many Americans, especially in conservative states where traditional religiosity remained an important part of public life. Bennett did not back down. "But there is another point of view, Mr. Vice President. Many are concerned that your public religiosity is a relatively new phenomenon, coinciding with your political career. In a profile in The New Yorker in 2016, you were described as a skeptic who was raised in a traditionally religious family but has distanced himself from organized religion." He opened the folder and quoted, "When in an interview with The Hill that same year, you said, 'I respect faith as a cultural phenomenon, but I'm more of a rationalist.'" End of quote. And suddenly, starting in 2018, you're not just a believer. You're practically a preacher in the political arena. Doesn't that seem strategic? The camera zoomed in on Vance's face. For the first time in the interview, real pain flashed in his eyes, quickly replaced by something resembling subdued anger. "You know, Marcus," he began quietly but confidently, "there are things I prefer not to talk about publicly. Not because I have nothing to say, but because some experiences are too personal, too intimate for television cameras." He paused as if making a difficult decision. "But since you have questioned the sincerity of my faith, one of the deepest aspects of my personality, I will tell a story that only those closest to me know." Vance pulled out from his inside pocket a small, battered Bible, which viewers had already glimpsed at the beginning of the interview. "In 2017, my younger brother was struggling with opioid addiction, the same epidemic that is decimating entire communities in Appalachia. At the same time, my grandmother, the woman who practically raised me, was in the terminal stages of cancer." His voice became quieter and barely restrained emotions could be heard in it. "October 23, 2017. At 3 in the morning, I was sitting by my grandmother's hospital bed. The doctors said she had a few days to live. That same evening, my brother overdosed. His third in a year." Bennett looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting such a personal revelation. But Vance continued, "In that moment, I felt absolutely powerless. All my Yale education, all my connections, all my accomplishments couldn't help the two people I love most. And that's when my grandmother, this dying woman, took my hand in her weak fingers and said, 'Jimmy, sometimes all we have is faith. Not that everything will be okay, but that everything has a meaning, even if we can't see it now.'" A low murmur ran through the studio. Even Bennett looked touched. "That night," Vance continued, "I walked out of the hospital, got in my car, and just screamed. Screamed in frustration, in anger, in despair. And then, for the first time in years, I prayed. Not for a miracle, not for political success, but for strength and clarity. For the ability to understand what I was supposed to do with my life, and how I could truly help people who were suffering the way my brother had, the way my grandmother had, the way I had suffered as a child in a dysfunctional family." He raised the Bible. This Bible belonged to my grandmother. On the first page, she wrote my name and the date of my baptism, June 5, 1994. On the last pages, she wrote down important events in our family and her prayers for each of us. I carry it with me not as a political prop, Marcus, but as a reminder of a woman whose faith was her strength in her darkest times. Bennett looked confused but tried to get back on track with the interview. "This is a very personal story, Mr. Vice President, and I appreciate your candor. But it doesn't quite answer the question about the role of religion in government." Vance nodded, returning to a more formal tone. "You are absolutely right, Marcus. Let me answer this directly. I believe in the constitutional principle of separation of church and state. I do not believe that the government should impose any religion or discriminate against people based on their faith or lack thereof." He leaned forward. "But I also believe that countless Americans, regardless of their particular faith, live with a deep faith in a higher power. That faith shapes their values, their decisions, their view of the world. And when I speak the language of faith, I am not trying to establish a state religion. I am speaking in a language that is understandable and familiar to millions of our fellow citizens. Bennett decided to change tactics. In your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast, you spoke of divine guidance in government decision-making. Could you elaborate on what exactly you meant? Some have interpreted this as a hint that you believe God directly guides the administration. Nervous laughter could be heard in the studio. Vance smiled. It's clear that the quote was taken out of context. If you watch the full speech, you'll see that I spoke about personal prayer and meditation, which helped me find wisdom and clarity in difficult situations. I have never claimed to receive direct instructions from God or that our administration operates under a divine mandate. He glanced around the studio. But you know what, Marcus? I'm not ashamed of my faith. I'm not ashamed of seeking wisdom in prayer. I'm not ashamed of the way the Bible and its teachings influence my understanding of justice, mercy, and human dignity. His gaze became firmer. And let me ask, why does a politician's faith cause such anxiety in a certain part of society? Why is it that mentioning God in public speech is considered almost a violation of a taboo, while any other sources of inspiration and moral orientation, from philosophy to literature, are considered acceptable? Bennett tried to answer. Because religion has historically been a source of division, and I beg to differ, Vance interrupted gently. Religion has also historically been a source of great good. The civil rights movement was deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. Martin Luther King was a Baptist preacher who quoted the Bible more often than the Constitution. The abolitionist movement that led to the end of slavery was in many ways a faith-based movement. He thought for a moment. You know what I noticed, Marcus? When left-wing politicians talk about their faith, they are praised for their authenticity. When conservatives do the same, they are accused of manipulation. That doesn't sound like a neutral position, does it? Bennett clearly felt the ground slipping from under his feet. But many observers note the synchronicity of your return to faith and your political turn. Doesn't this raise legitimate questions? Of course it does, Vance agreed, and I'm happy to answer them. My political evolution and my spiritual awakening happened at roughly the same time. Not because one was a tool for the other, but because both were the result of the same life experiences. He leaned closer to Bennett. When I was writing my book, I delved into the lives of people who are quickly written off by the elites as deployable or backward. And you know what I discovered? That for many of them, faith is not just a Sunday pastime or a political stance. It is literally what keeps them alive in the darkest of times. His voice became more passionate. I have seen single mothers who hold on through faith when all else falls apart. I have seen veterans whose invisible wounds from war heal somewhat in communities of faith. I have seen former drug addicts who find strength in prayer when professional therapy and medications fail. Vance paused and looked directly into the camera. And let me say something that may shock many in the media elite. I am not ashamed to stand with these people. I am not ashamed to speak their language. I am not ashamed to defend their right to have their faith respected and not ridiculed as the opium of the people or a political tool. The audience applauded, hesitantly at first, then more confidently. Bennett glanced anxiously at the producer, who was frantically gesturing to the cameraman not to show the audience's reaction. Bennett tried to regain the initiative. But don't you see the problem with the fact that religious rhetoric can exclude Americans of other faiths or none? Doesn't that run counter to the inclusivity we should be promoting? Vance shook his head. You know what really excludes people, Marcus? When we create a society where some kinds of deeply held beliefs are welcome in public space, while others are taboo. When a politician can talk openly about how Kant's philosophy or Hemingway's books influenced his worldview, but the mention of the Bible invites accusations of violating the separation of church and state. He glanced around the studio. Akrash, true inclusivity is when all Americans can come into public spaces as they are, without hiding fundamental aspects of their identity. For many, faith is precisely that aspect. Bennett looked irritated. You cleverly avoid answering my question about the temporal coincidence of your religious awakening and political career. I answered that question directly, Vance countered. But if you want specific dates and documentary evidence, I can provide them. He took out his Bible again. Here is my grandmother's entry from November 17, 2017. Jimmy prayed with me today for the first time in many years. Thank you, Lord, for bringing my grandson back to you, even through such trials. Vance closed the Bible and looked at Bennett. It was a few months before I even began to consider the possibility of a political career. So no, Marcus, my faith was not a tool for political ambitions. On the contrary, my spiritual awakening was one of the reasons why I decided to enter politics. Because I saw how many people in our country feel forgotten, not only economically, but also culturally, spiritually. Bennett decided to approach it from a different angle. Many criticize your position as hypocritical, given that the president you support is hardly a model of Christian virtues. How do you explain this? Vance closed his eyes for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts. In the Gospel of Matthew, there is a story about how the Pharisees criticized Jesus for eating with tax collectors and sinners. Do you know what Jesus answered? It is not those who are healthy who need a doctor, but those who are sick. He opened his eyes. I don't want to draw direct parallels, but the point is that true faith is not about judging imperfect people or claiming to be perfect. It is about recognizing that we are all imperfect. We all make mistakes, and we all need forgiveness and a second chance. Bennett smiled sarcastically. So you are saying that the president is a sick person in need of spiritual healing? Vance shook his head. No, Marcus, I'm saying that we're all imperfect, including me, including you, including every politician who has ever held office. And that one of the problems with modern political culture is that we demand impossible moral perfection from public figures while turning a blind eye to our own shortcomings. He leaned forward. You know what really struck me about the president when I started working with him? Not his public persona, but his genuine commitment to making life better for forgotten Americans. His refusal to treat traditional believers as relics of the past. His willingness to listen to those the elites had long since stopped hearing. Bennett began to lose patience. Mr. Vice President, with due respect, you are turning a serious issue about religion and state into a sentimental story. The fact remains that your public religiosity seems strategically advantageous for your political career. You know, Marcus, Vance smiled unexpectedly, there's something deeply ironic about your approach. You started this segment expressing concern that I was talking about faith too much, and now you're basically accusing me of not having a deep or sincere faith. A chuckle ran through the studio. Bennett looked taken aback. I didn't say, that's exactly what you meant, Vance said calmly. And you know what's interesting? I don't remember you asking these questions of left-wing politicians who talk about their faith. I don't remember you demanding proof of their sincerity or accusing them of using religion as a political tool. He looked straight into the camera. Maybe the problem isn't my faith, Marcus. Maybe the problem is that a certain part of our society believes that conservatives don't have the right to sincere faith, that the expression of traditional religious values in public space is only permissible for those who hold the correct political views. A tense silence fell over the studio as Bennett desperately tried to find a way to regain control of the interview. Let's get back to some concrete examples. In your speech to the Supreme Court, you said, and I quote, "The laws of man must reflect the laws of God." Many saw this as a direct call for theocracy. Can you explain what you meant? Vance nodded. Of course. I was saying that our laws should reflect fundamental moral principles, many of which have roots in religious traditions. Not that we should literally transfer biblical laws into modern legislation. He paused. But let's talk about a deeper question. Why is it so alarming to mention religious foundations for moral values? Martin Luther King Jr., in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, appealed to divine law and biblical imagery. Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, spoke of God's will and quoted scripture. Why is such language considered inappropriate or dangerous today? Bennett looked irritated. Because we live in a more pluralistic society where America has always been a pluralistic society, Vance said softly. Even in the days of Lincoln and King, the difference is that we used to understand that pluralism doesn't mean banishing religion from the public square. It means that all traditions, religious and secular, have a place at the table of public discourse. His voice became firmer. And today we see a strange situation. Religion must remain a strictly private matter, while all other sources of values and beliefs can be freely expressed in the public space. This is not neutrality, Marcus. This is discrimination against believers. The applause rang out, louder and more confident this time. Bennett cast a desperate glance at the producer, who was trying unsuccessfully to calm the audience. Mr. Vice President, Bennett raised his voice to be heard above the noise, you are adept at turning defense into offense. But the fact remains that your faith has become a central element of your public persona, precisely when it has become politically expedient to do so. Vance shook his head. You know what's really sad, Marcus? That in modern America, genuine faith is considered so unlikely that the only explanation the media elite can come up with is political calculation. He took his Bible out of his pocket and placed it on his lap. This book was with me in Iraq when we came under mortar fire, and I was sure I wouldn't live until morning. It was with me in the hospital when my brother was fighting for his life after an overdose. It was with me the day I buried my grandmother, the only truly stable adult in my childhood. Vance looked up and the camera showed his eyes, which glistened with unshed tears. And you know what I say to all the cynics who think my faith is a political strategy? You can take away my job, my reputation, my career, but you can't take away my faith. Because it was with me long before I entered politics, and it will remain with me after I leave Washington. The studio was silent, broken only by the soft sobs of some of the audience members. Even Bennett looked taken aback by the vice president's sincerity. He hesitated, clearly unprepared for such an emotional response, then tried to return to the role of a tough interviewer. You really know how to speak persuasively, Mr. Vice President, but many Americans still wonder how a man of your education and intellect can believe in, how can I put it, what many consider the mythology of the past. There was a murmur of outrage in the room. Bennett had just crossed an invisible line, insulting not only the vice president, but millions of religious Americans. Vance sat up straighter in his chair, his gaze cold as steel. Marcus, he said quietly, but every word rang out in the tense silence of the studio. You've just demonstrated the very kind of condescending elitism that has driven millions of Americans away from mainstream media. The very arrogance that an educated person can't truly believe in God is not just wrong, it's dangerous to the very fabric of our society. We're back on the air after a short commercial break, Marcus Bennett said, tossing back a perfectly coiffed lock of hair. We're continuing our conversation with Vice President James David Vance. Backstage, Diana Hendricks, the show's executive producer, looked frankly alarmed. During a break, she held an emergency consultation with Bennett, using off-air TV jargon. He's outmaneuvering you, Marcus, she hissed. This conversation about faith has gotten completely out of hand. Half of America First is discussing his comments about his grandmother and prayer. We need to change our tone immediately. What do you suggest? Bennett dabbed his forehead with a designer handkerchief. Your signature tactic. A hard personal attack. Put him in his place. Remind him who's in charge here. Bennett nodded. It was not for nothing that his colleagues nicknamed him the political surgeon. He always knew where and how to make an incision to provoke the maximum reaction. The studio lights came back on. Vance looked composed after an intense conversation about faith, but his fatigue was noticeable to a careful observer. The slight shadows under his eyes, the subtle tension in his shoulders. Mr. Vice President, Bennett began with deceptive gentleness, after our discussion of your religiosity, I would like to return to your relationship with the president. After all, it is that relationship that defines your current role in American politics. Vance nodded politely, ready to continue the conversation. Many observers have noted, Bennett consulted his notes, that despite your previous criticality, you have become one of the most loyal members of the administration. Some have even used the term blind loyalty, given that you defend decisions that you would once have called unacceptable. Bennett paused, watching Vance's reaction, then decided to strike directly. To put it bluntly, Mr. Chahuri, Vice President, it appears that you have sold your principles for a seat in the White House. How do you respond to those who see you as a political opportunist who uses religion and patriotism as a cover for a simple lust for power? The studio went dead silent. The faces of the audience reflected amazement. Even by the standards of Bennett, who was known for his aggressiveness, such a direct accusation of corruption was unprecedented. Backstage, Diana nodded contentedly. This was exactly the turn she had been looking for. The camera zoomed in on Vance's face. His eyes narrowed for a moment, and a collective gasp went through the studio as the audience waited for a burst of righteous anger. Instead, something like compassion flickered in the vice president's eyes. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, even tinged with sadness. You know, Marcus, Vance began, and the studio went so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioners. There's something deeply sad about the way we discuss politics in this country. How easily we attribute the basest motives to people we disagree with. He paused. You just accused me of selling my principles for a seat in the White House. That I am a cynical opportunist who uses faith as a political tool. These are serious accusations that affect not just my political positions, but my character, my integrity, my soul. Vance sat up straighter in his chair, his voice firmer but calmer. And you know what's telling? You phrased it not as a question, but as a statement disguised as a question. You didn't ask, how do you respond to criticism? You said, you've sold out your principles. Explain yourself. Bennett tried to intervene. I am simply reflecting the opinion of many. No, Marcus, Vance interrupted, gently but firmly. You are not reflecting opinion. You are actively shaping it. When you, one of the most influential journalists in the country, call the vice president-elect an unprincipled opportunist on primetime national television, you are not just asking a tough question, you are participating in the destruction of trust in democratic institutions. A murmur of surprise ran through the studio. Vance had suddenly gone from defensive to offensive, and he did it with dignity and without raising his voice. But let's talk about principles, Vance continued. What it means to be a person of principle. For me, principle is not a stubborn adherence to once-and-for-all views, regardless of new information or experience. It is loyalty to fundamental values, honesty, fairness, service to the country, even as specific political positions evolve. Vance paused, looking Bennett straight in the eye. It is not growth and evolution that betray principles, Marcus. It is when we put party affiliation above truth, when we refuse to acknowledge the merits of political opponents for fear of being excluded from our tribe, when we demonize dissenters instead of trying to understand them. Bennett looked slightly taken aback by the unexpected turn of the conversation, but quickly recovered. With all due respect, Mr. Vice President, you are avoiding a specific question. How do you explain your abrupt shift from critic of the administration to its defender? If this is not political opportunism, then what is? Vance nodded calmly. I have answered this question before, but I am happy to repeat it. I have changed my assessment of the president and his policies based on direct experience working with him and observing the results of his decisions. I have seen how his economic policies really help those Americans I wrote about in my book. I have seen how his spontaneity and unsystematic approach sometimes achieve breakthroughs where decades of conventional policies have failed. He leaned forward slightly. Sure you. And you know what the hardest thing is, Marcus. To publicly admit that you were wrong. It would have been much easier for my career to remain a critic, to continue to collect applause in liberal circles, to receive invitations to intellectual conferences, to maintain the image of a good Republican in the eyes of certain media. Political opportunism would have dictated precisely this path. Bennett decided to change tactics. But even if we accept your version, isn't it true that you have become much less critical, less independent in your judgments? You defend every tweet, every controversial statement, every controversial decision. Where is that independence of thought that J.D., Vance, the writer and commentator, was famous for? Vance shook his head. Here, Marcus, is where we get to the interesting part. I am not defending every tweet, as you put it. I am defending the direction our administration is heading, the grand strategy, not every tactical detail. He straightened up. But you know what's really telling? The double standards in covering this topic. When a Democratic vice president demonstrates loyalty to his president, the media calls it teamwork and an effective tandem. When a Republican does the same, he is accused of losing independence and blind loyalty. Vance paused, then suddenly went on the counteroffensive. And since we're talking about principles and independence of judgment, let me ask you a question, Marcus. How independent are you in your assessments of our administration? Bennett looked shocked. Sorry? That's a simple question, Vance continued calmly. Over the past year, 78% of the guests on your show who discussed our administration's policies were critical of them. 92% of the discussions of the president's foreign policy were negative. Is that your definition of journalistic objectivity? There was a stunned silence in the studio. Vance, who had been thought to be cornered, suddenly went on the offensive, and he did so with precise figures and facts. Bennett looked taken aback. We invite guests based on their expertise. And somehow, Vance interrupted gently, the pundits who criticize the administration get disproportionately more airtime? Marcus, you're a smart man. Do you really expect Americans to believe this is a fluke? Backstage, Diana Hendricks fidgeted with her clipboard. This wasn't in the script. Bennett was supposed to be the hunter, not the hunted. Vance continued, his voice calm but every word hitting the mark. You know what's ironic, Marcus? You accuse me of lacking principles and independence of judgment. But you yourself represent a media industry that is increasingly turning into an echo chamber, where objectivity is not valued, but rather conformity to a certain ideological line. Bennett began to become noticeably irritated. Mr. Vice President, we are here to discuss your political career, not my journalistic methods. But aren't these things related? Vance asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. You're asking questions about my integrity and independence. Isn't it fair to ask similar questions about your journalistic objectivity? He leaned forward slightly. Because you see, true independence is not just about criticizing the government, no matter who represents it. It is a willingness to follow the facts, even when they contradict your prejudices. It is the ability to acknowledge the merits of opponents and the shortcomings of allies. It is an intellectual honesty that is becoming increasingly rare in our polarized media landscape. There was a tense silence in the studio. Bennett looked like he was on the wrong side of the tracks. His usual confidence had been replaced by obvious discomfort. He hesitated, then tried to regain the initiative. My job is to ask tough questions, especially to people in power. And rightly so, Vance agreed. Tough questions are necessary. Skepticism is necessary. But there is a difference between healthy skepticism and ideological bias, between a journalist who is sincerely seeking the truth and one who is simply trying to confirm a preconceived notion. Vance paused, looking directly into the camera. And this is perhaps our main social problem today. We have lost the ability to have a real dialogue. We no longer listen to understand, we listen to refute. We do not seek common ground, but rather we reinforce the lines of division. Bennett, clearly losing control of the situation, moved to more aggressive tactics. Mr. Vice President, with all due respect, you are a master at steering the conversation from concrete questions to abstract reasoning. But Americans deserve straight answers about your role in an administration that many consider the most divisive in modern history. Vance thought for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Americans do deserve straight answers. And here's my straight answer. I'm proud of my work in this administration. Proud of the economic results we've achieved for working families. Proud of the fact that we've begun to bring manufacturing back to regions that have suffered from deindustrialization for decades. Proud of our diplomatic breakthroughs that experts thought were impossible. His voice became stronger. And yes, we have disagreements with the president. We have different styles, different approaches to many issues. But we discuss these disagreements behind closed doors because we understand that public conflicts within the administration do not serve the interests of the country. Bennett tried to interrupt. But isn't that... Let me finish, Marcus, Vance said calmly but firmly. You asked a question, and I'm answering it. Silence fell over the studio. Bennett, accustomed to controlling every second of the broadcast, looked genuinely confused. The point is, Vance continued, that true integrity is not about never changing your views or publicly criticizing your colleagues for the sake of applause from a particular audience. It is about always pursuing the truth, even when it is inconvenient. Always putting the interests of the country above personal or partisan interests. And those are the principles that guide me every day when I enter the White House. Vance turned directly to Bennett. And now, Marcus, let me ask you a direct question. Can you say with the same sincerity that in your journalistic work, you are guided solely by the search for truth and not by ratings or ideological preferences? A tense silence fell over the studio. Bennett looked cornered, a situation that usually befell his guests, not himself. He was clearly struggling with himself. I try to be objective, but of course everyone has their own beliefs. Exactly, Vance nodded softly. Everyone has beliefs, including journalists. And the first step to true objectivity is acknowledging your own biases, not pretending they don't exist. Bennett looked increasingly confused. Backstage, Diana was making desperate gestures for him to take control of the situation. He took a deep breath and tried to return to his original plan. Mr. Vice President, with all due respect, you have turned the tables, and now I find myself in the place of the person being questioned. But we are here to discuss your role in the administration. We are discussing it, Marcus, Vance replied calmly. Just not in the narrow framework you're trying to impose. Not through the artificial dichotomy of principled critic versus unprincipled defender, but through a more complex, nuanced reality in which growth, evolution, and dedication to a common cause are possible without losing principles. Vance paused, then added with a slight smile. And frankly, your unwillingness to acknowledge your own bias while simultaneously demanding absolute transparency from me illustrates precisely the double standards I'm talking about. There were cheers in the studio. Camera operators filming the audience showed many nodding, even those who had seemed skeptical of the vice president at the start of the interview. Bennett looked like a man whose professional instincts were warring with the growing awareness that he was trapped in his own mind. His face was flushed, his hands shaking slightly as he shuffled through his notes. He glanced at his watch as if seeking salvation. We have to take another commercial break. Stay tuned. The most interesting part of our conversation with Vice President James David Vance is ahead. As soon as the off-air sign came on, Bennett snatched the microphone and quickly went backstage, where Diana, pale from the tension, was already waiting for him. Vance remained seated in his chair, his expression calm and collected. Several people in the audience dared to give him a thumbs up, a gesture of approval that would have been impossible at the start of the interview. The balance of power has shifted. The man who was supposed to be publicly humiliated has turned his defense into a graceful offense, never descending into rudeness or personal attacks. And now the entire media landscape is waiting to see what happens after the commercial break. Will a professional anchor regain control, or will the vice president continue to set the tone for this unexpected clash of the worlds of politics and journalism? "And we're back on air," said Marcus Bennett, his usual perfection visibly shaken. His tie was slightly askew and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead under the bright studio lights. Backstage, Diana Hendricks finished an emergency meeting with her team. Her final instructions to Bennett were clear. Use the secret weapon, now or never. A thin black folder, which he had been holding out of sight until now, appeared in Bennett's hands. "Mr. Vice President," he began with feigned confidence, "despite your rhetoric about principles and authenticity, facts remain facts. We have documentary evidence that casts doubt on the entire story of your so-called evolution." Bennett opened the folder with theatrical slowness. "I have before me exclusive materials received from a former member of your campaign team. According to these documents, your return to traditional values and religious rhetoric was a carefully planned strategy, developed after focus group research." There was a collective sigh in the studio. Bennett held up the document, showing it to the cameras. "Here's an internal memo dated April 2018, 3 months before your first public appearance on your new conservative positions. I quote, 'Research shows that voters in key Midwestern and Appalachian states respond positively to traditional religious rhetoric and conservative values. It is recommended that the candidate's public appearances be adjusted accordingly.'" Bennett looked triumphantly first at Vance, then at the camera. What follows is a list of specific topics, from family values to patriotism, with recommendations for integrating them into your speeches. And what's especially interesting is that there's a special section on how to frame your previous criticism of the president as constructive dialogue within the party instead of fundamental disagreements. Bennett slammed the folder shut. "This does not look like a sincere evolution of views, Mr. Vice President. It looks more like a cynical political calculation, does it not?" A tense silence fell over the studio. The cameras zoomed in on the audience's faces, a mixture of shock, curiosity, and, for some, poorly concealed satisfaction. Backstage, Diana smiled triumphantly, the trump card they were saving for the most dramatic moment. All eyes turned to Vance. Journalists in these situations look for panic, confusion, anger, any emotion that can be captured on camera and turned into a viral moment. But the vice president's face remained calm. He looked at Bennett not like a man caught in a lie, but like a teacher watching a student make a logical error. After a short pause, Vance leaned forward slightly. "Marcus, can I see this document?" Bennett clearly hadn't expected that reaction. He hesitated for a moment, then handed the folder to Vance. "Please, the facts speak for themselves." Vance studied the document, turning the pages with the methodical precision of a former lawyer. Then he looked up at Bennett. "Interesting. A document without a signature, without official letterhead, without any identifying marks. Just a set of recommendations that could have been created by anyone at any time." Bennett was quick to object. "Our source." "Your anonymous source," Vance corrected gently. "A source you cannot name, who has provided you with a document whose authenticity cannot be verified." Vance returned the folder. "But even if we assume that this document is real, Marcus, what exactly does it prove? That a political campaign studies the opinions of voters? That the team analyzes the audience's reaction to various topics and formulations? This is standard practice in any campaign, from municipal elections to presidential ones." Bennett looked slightly confused. "Hey, and I'm right, but here it is clearly stated that your turn to traditionalism was based on political calculations." "No, Marcus," Vance said calmly. "It says here that my team analyzed audience reactions to various topics. That's not the same as saying that my personal beliefs were formed based on focus groups." Vance paused. "But let me answer more directly, because this is an important question. You suggest that my return to traditional values and faith was a cynical political maneuver that began in 2018. He slowly took out a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age, from the inside pocket of his jacket. "This is a letter I wrote in December 2005 when I was a student at Ohio University, long before I could even dream of a political career. A letter to my political science professor, who was a staunch liberal and atheist, but also an outstanding teacher and a decent man." Vance carefully unfolded the letter. "I wrote this after a political philosophy course where we discussed secularism and the role of religion in modern society. Let me read a short excerpt. Professor Klein, I am grateful to you for this semester. You have forced me to rethink many of my beliefs, and although I disagree with your conclusions, your arguments deserve deep respect. However, I cannot accept the idea that traditional values are simply a relic of the past, doomed to disappear in a progressive society. My own experience growing up amid chaos and disintegration in Appalachia tells a different story. I have seen how faith and traditional morality became the only anchor for many families, the only structure that could withstand the destructive forces of poverty, drugs, and despair. This role of religion and tradition is not theoretical for me. It is practical, lived. I believe that America needs not an abandonment of these values, but a renewed understanding of them. A recognition that true freedom does not exist in a vacuum, but in the context of responsibility to family, community, country, and, for those of faith, to God. Vance folded the letter carefully. That was written 13 years before the date on your revealing document, Marcus, long before I had any political ambitions. And as you can see, the core beliefs I express now were already there. He placed the letter on the table between them. I did not publish this letter. I did not use it in the campaign. I did not turn it into a political asset. It remained part of my personal archive, evidence of the internal dialogue that I had with myself long before my public career. The studio went completely silent. Even the most cynical viewers couldn't help but feel the power of the moment. Bennett looked at the letter like someone whose worldview had just collided with an uncomfortable reality. Can I see? His voice sounded unusually uncertain. Vance nodded and pulled the letter forward. Bennett studied it carefully, noting the yellowed paper, the faded ink, the distinctive font of old printers from the early 2000s. This, he was clearly trying to find a catch but couldn't. Looks genuine. Because it's real, Marcus, Vance said simply, as is my faith, as are my beliefs, as is my evolution, which was not a sudden political maneuver, but a long process of growth and reinvention. Vance looked around the studio. And you know what the saddest thing is? That sincerity is so rare in our political culture that when we encounter it, our first reaction is to look for a hidden motive, a secret strategy, a cynical calculation. He turned to the audience. I do not claim to be perfect. I have made and will make mistakes. My views will continue to evolve as I gain new experiences and information. But the foundation, my fundamental values, my faith, my desire to serve my country, remains unchanged. Bennett looked like a man in conflict. His professional instincts were to press the attack, to find a new angle, to not admit defeat. But something in Vance's sincerity, in the authenticity of the moment, made him do something he had rarely done in his career. Stop and really listen. He paused, then collected himself. I appreciate your candor, Mr. Vice President, but let me ask the question from a slightly different angle. If your traditional values are truly so deeply rooted, how do you explain your progressive positions on many issues during your career as a commentator? Vance nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. That's a great question, Marcus. And the answer isn't simple, because real life is rarely black and white. He paused, choosing his words. In those years, I was trying to find a synthesis between the traditional values I grew up with and the progressive ideas I encountered at Yale. I truly believed that it was possible to build a kind of bridge between these worlds. Vance sighed. But the more I worked in so-called elite circles, the more I noticed not just disagreement with traditional values, but open contempt for them. Contempt for people of faith, for patriotism, for the idea of national identity. And most disturbingly, contempt for ordinary Americans who adhere to these values. His voice became quieter, more intimate. And at some point I realized that by trying to please these elite circles, I was betraying not only my roots, but also millions of Americans, about whom I later wrote in my book. People who feel forgotten not only economically, but also culturally and spiritually. Vance straightened up. So yes, my positions have evolved, but not because I am a cynical opportunist, but because I finally found the courage to stand up for the values I have always believed in, even when it was unpopular in the circles where I was trying to build a career. Bennett looked deep in thought. You paint a picture of a cultural divide that is perhaps even deeper than the political one. Exactly, Marcus, Vance perked up. And that, I believe, is the real problem with modern America. Not the opposition of left and right political programs, but the loss of the ability to listen to each other, to see the people behind the political labels. He glanced around the studio. We have created a culture where people with different views don't just disagree with each other. They live in parallel realities. They watch different news, read different books, interact in different social circles. And gradually, they lose the ability to even imagine that someone could sincerely hold opposing views without being malicious or stupid. There was a surprising silence in the studio. Not tense, as before, but attentive, thoughtful. Even the most skeptical viewers seemed to momentarily set aside their preconceptions to truly hear a man speaking from the heart. Bennett, to the surprise of everyone, including his own production team, asked the question without the usual aggression, but with genuine curiosity. Sir, do you think this split can be overcome? And if so, how? Vance paused for a moment, his eyes clouded over, as if he were looking into some distant future. I believe it can, Marcus. But to do so, we must return to a fundamental truth, that what unites us as Americans is stronger than what divides us. His voice grew stronger. We need to learn to listen to each other again, not to find a weak point in the opponent's argument, but to really understand where the person is coming from, what values and experiences shape their views. Vance looked straight into the camera. And perhaps most importantly, we need to stop demonizing dissenters. Stop attributing the worst motives to those with whom we disagree. Realize that it is possible to disagree deeply, fundamentally on political issues, and still respect each other as people, as fellow citizens, as Americans. Bennett was silent, clearly undergoing an internal transformation. In that moment, he was not a TV presenter doing a job, but simply a man confronted with a sincerity that could not be faked. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, without its usual polished smoothness, but with a note of genuine reflection. You know, Mr. Vice President, I've done thousands of interviews, trying to catch politicians in contradictions, to make them lose their cool, to create memorable television moments. He paused as if surprised by his own words. But I rarely thought about what you just said, that behind every political label, there is a person with his own history, his own path, his own sincere convictions. Bennett looked confused. His professional mask dropped. I really don't know what to say. This is not the conversation I expected to have today. And that may be the problem, Marcus, Vance said softly. We're all too caught up in expected scenarios, canned responses, predictable confrontations. We've forgotten how to have a real conversation, one in which both sides can be surprised, changed, enriched. There was an atmosphere in the studio that no one expected. Not a heated confrontation, not political posturing, but a moment of genuine human contact. Backstage, Diana Hendricks stood there, her expression one of bewilderment. Ratings had skyrocketed, but not because of the scandal she had hoped for. People were glued to their screens to watch a politician being publicly destroyed, but to witness something far rarer in modern politics, a moment of truth. Bennett, as if waking from a trance, looked at his watch. Muffwinham, we have very little time left on the air, Mr. Vice President. Is there anything else you would like to say to the American people? Vance thought for a moment, then nodded. Yes, Marcus. I would like to speak directly to every American, regardless of their political views, faith, or background. He looked straight into the camera. I know many of you are tired of political infighting, tired of feeling like your voice is not being heard, that your concerns are unimportant, that your values are being ridiculed. And I want to tell you, I hear you. Even if we disagree, I respect your right to have those views. I respect the experiences that have shaped them. I respect you as fellow citizens with whom we are building the future of this great country. Vance's voice grew stronger, and it carried the confidence of a man speaking from the heart. We can heal the rift that divides us today, not by compromising our fundamental principles, but by restoring the civic culture that once made America great. A culture where disagreement does not lead to contempt, where debate does not degenerate into demonization, where politics does not become religion. Bennett listened with a thoughtful expression on his face. When Vance finished, there was a hush in the studio, which then exploded into applause. Not partisan, not ideological, but deeply human. People were applauding not a politician, but a man who dared to be authentic in a world where authenticity had become a rarity. Even Bennett, to the amazement of his team, joined in the applause. At this point, he was not a journalist with a subpoena, but simply a man recognizing the power of the truth he had encountered. The applause died down. There was silence in the studio. Not the tense, electric silence that had characterized much of the interview, but a deep, almost meditative silence of understanding. Bennett looked like a man awakening from a long sleep. His face, usually impenetrable beneath a layer of professional skepticism, was now expressing something far more complex. A mixture of confusion, thoughtfulness, and, most surprisingly, genuine curiosity. Mr. Vice President, he began in an unusually soft voice, We have a few minutes left on the air. Instead of summing up, let me ask a question that I rarely ask my guests. Vance nodded, showing that he was listening attentively. How do you think we can truly overcome the divisions in our society? Bennett asked with genuine interest. Not just talk about unity as a political slogan, but actually start listening to each other? There was an unusual note of vulnerability in his voice, as if this question was important not only to the audience, but to him personally. Vance thought for a moment, looking not at Bennett, but as if through him, at something more. You know, Marcus, in the Marine Corps we had a saying, "It's easy to die for your country, much harder to live for it." In a way that applies to our current situation. It's easy to shout political slogans, relatively easy even to hate those with whom we disagree. But it's much harder to do the day-to-day work of citizenship, listening, respecting, finding common ground. Vance paused, choosing his words. I think healing divisions doesn't start in Washington or in television studios or even in the voting booth. It starts at the kitchen table, on school boards, in churches and synagogues, in local communities where people with different views still have to work together to solve specific problems. His voice became stronger. And you know what gives me hope? That outside of the Twitter battles and TV debates, I can see how it works. I was in Ohio last week, in a small town as divided along political lines as the rest of the country. But when the river overflowed its banks, no one asked party affiliation before extending a hand. Democrats and Republicans worked side by side, filling sandbags, evacuating elderly neighbors. Bennett nodded. But how do we transfer this spirit of cooperation to the national level? Especially now, when the very mechanisms for obtaining information seem to be pushing us towards even greater polarization? The first step, Vance replied, is to acknowledge our share of responsibility. Not just politicians, but journalists and ordinary citizens. Ask yourself, am I participating in hate speech for the sake of likes and retweets? Am I demonizing entire groups of people because I disagree with their views? He leaned forward. And perhaps most importantly, we must bring humanity back to our public discourse. Remember that behind every political position stands a person with a history, with fears, with hopes. A person who, like us, is simply trying to find the best way forward based on their understanding and experience. Vance glanced around the studio. And that takes courage, Marcus. Not the loud courage that comes with angry speeches and accusations, but the quiet courage that it takes to say, maybe I don't understand everything. Maybe I have something to learn from those with whom I disagree. Bennett looked at Vance with something akin to respect, a feeling that rarely found its way onto his usually cynical face. This is an unusual perspective for a modern politician. Perhaps, Vance agreed with a slight smile, but I believe that this is the vision America craves. Not more division, not more us versus them, but a real, honest conversation about how we, despite our differences, can move forward together. Bennett looked at his watch and said with genuine regret, unfortunately, our time on air is coming to an end. Mr. Vice President, I thank you for one of the most unusual and, dare I say it, important conversations in the history of our program. He extended his hand. And if I may make a personal comment, Bennett added, clearly going beyond his usual professional demeanor, you've forced me to rethink some of my own prejudices. That's a rare gift. Vance shook the outstretched hand. Likewise, Marcus. Real dialogue always changes both sides. The cameras pulled back to show a wide shot of the studio as Bennett turned to the audience. That was Straight Talk with Vice President James David Vance. Thank you for your attention. Good night, America. As the lights dimmed and the crew began packing up their equipment, there was an unusual atmosphere in the studio. Instead of the usual bustle and relief that comes with finishing a difficult broadcast, people moved more slowly, as if unwilling to disturb the moment that had become more than just a TV interview. Diana Hendricks, executive producer, approached Bennett with a tablet in her hand. You won't believe it, her usually emotionless face expressed amazement. The ratings are off the charts. This is the most watched episode in the show's history, and social media, it's exploded. She held out a tablet showing real-time statistics. The hashtag #RushVance the Hypocrite that started it all this morning has been completely replaced by new ones. Unsure Real Talk and Harsher Man Behind Politics. And it's not just Republicans. Even liberal accounts are sharing clips from the interview. Bennett nodded slowly, looking at the numbers. You know, Diana, something strange happened today. Something real. The producer looked closely at her usually cynical host. Mark, don't tell me you bought this whole sincere speech. This is politics. There is no room for authenticity here. Bennett glanced toward Vance, who was quietly chatting with a few viewers who had lingered after the broadcast. What if there is, Diana? What if we've spent so long looking for the catch, the hidden motives, the secret strategies that we've forgotten how to recognize real sincerity when we see it? Vance exited the studio through a service entrance. Contrary to security expectations, a small but energetic crowd had gathered outside. Not protesters, as feared, but ordinary people looking to show their support. They greeted him with applause and cheers. A young woman with a child in her arms pushed her way forward. Mr. Vice President, I wanted to thank you personally. My husband and I come from different political camps. The last few years have been difficult for our family. Today, for the first time in a long time, we watched a political show together, and for the first time, we didn't argue but talked. Really talked. Her eyes sparkled with emotion. You reminded us that behind the political labels, we can still see each other as people. Vance, touched by this confession, smiled softly. This is the best compliment I could receive. Take care of your family. It is more important than any political differences. Vance's phone rang as he was getting into an armored car. The number was identified as White House. J.D. The president's voice was instantly recognizable. I just watched your interview. Watch the whole thing, from start to finish. Mr. President, Vance began, bracing himself for any reaction. He knew he had expressed some ideas that might seem unorthodox from the party line. It was spectacularly disastrous, the president continued. Honestly, when you agreed to interview Bennett, I thought you were crazy. The guy has destroyed the careers of people far more experienced than you. But what you did today, it was more than just a good political performance. Vance heard a note in the president's voice that cameras rarely caught. Genuine respect. I'm proud to have chosen you, J.D. You reminded me why we're in this failed politics in the first place. Not for power, but for the country we love. Thank you, Mr. President, Vance replied quietly. It means a lot to me. Tomorrow at 7 in the Oval Office, the president concluded the conversation practically. We have a lot of work to do. And, J.D., it's good to have you on our side. When Vance returned to the White House, his team greeted him with expressions that oscillated between amazement and delight. The phones haven't stopped ringing, said Sarah Coleman, his press secretary. Requests for interviews from all the major networks, invitations to podcasts, offers of book deals. And, sir, you should take a look at this, the young assistant added, holding out the iPad. The screen showed an article from the Washington Post, the same newspaper that had published the expose on Vance's duplicity that morning. The headline read, A Moment of Authenticity, How James David Vance Could Change American Politics. Vance quickly scanned the text. In an era when politics has become a theatrical spectacle and sincerity is considered political suicide, Vice President Vance's interview tonight may mark a turning point in our public discourse. Whether or not we agree with his political positions, it is hard to deny the power of authenticity he demonstrated. Even them, Vance shook his head with a slight smile. The world is full of surprises. Sir, Sarah looked unusually agitated. You changed the game today. They don't know how to react because you didn't follow the standard script. Vance shook his head. I was just being myself, Sarah. Sometimes that's the most radical thing a politician can do. Hours later, while most of Washington slept, Vance stood at the window of his office in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, watching the first rays of dawn touch the Washington Monument, turning the white marble pinkish gold. This dawn felt special, not just the beginning of a new day, but perhaps a new approach to politics, an approach based not on division and demonization, but on shared values and human understanding. Vance pulled a tattered photograph of his grandmother from his pocket, the woman who had raised him amid the chaos and poverty of Appalachia, who had taught him that authenticity was not a weakness, but the greatest strength. You were right, Grandma, he said quietly, looking at the photo. The truth really does have power that cannot be faked. The phone on the table vibrated, a new message from an unknown number. Vance opened it and raised his eyebrows in surprise. This is Marcus Bennett. Got your number from a mutual friend. Just wanted to say thanks for talking to me today. It got me thinking about the kind of journalism I practice and the kind of America we're creating with our words. Maybe we should continue this conversation off camera? Not for an article or a show, just as two Americans who, despite our differences, want what's best for our country. Vance smiled and began typing his reply. Behind him, the sun rose higher, bathing Washington in the clear light of a new day.